Hello, welcome back to Teen Story Share. This week we're continuing The Raging Quiet by Sherryl Jordan. If you missed last week's reading when we began this story, that will be linked down below. The main character is a young woman named Marnie, 16 years old, who has just married a man who is more than twice her age. We're going to find out in today's reading that she did that mainly to help her family, and we're going to find out how and why. Also, not a spoiler because it is right in the description at the beginning of the book, is that her new husband dies only a couple days after the wedding. She becomes friends then with a local young man who everyone thinks is either mad or possessed by demons, but through interacting with him, she learns that he's actually deaf. They become friends, and later on in the book, they have to deal with suspicious villagers and a witchcraft trial. In last week's reading, Marnie learned that the man she married was actually not the gentleman she thought he was. And he has also hinted that there is something mysterious about the cottage that they've just moved into. So, lots to read about. Chapter 3. The gray-eyed youth stood on the hill above the cove, watching the young woman down on the beach. She had lit a fire on the sand and was carrying out straw from the house and burning it. Beyond her, on the rocks, clothes and wood were spread to dry in the sun. The man was nowhere in sight, gone, along with the horse and wagon. The youth began to run down the hill toward her, but halted several times, hesitant and afraid. Still bent over the fire, Marnie looked up and saw him. She stood up straight and pushed back her hair. "Good morning," she called, smiling. The youth grinned and approached with surer strides. A little way from her, he stopped, his face uncertain again and tense. Marnie noticed that he carried a small basket. The acrid smoke from the fire drifted across him, and he coughed. "Would you like a cup of mead?" Marnie asked. "I have nothing for us to eat, I'm afraid, but you're welcome to a drink." The youth simply gazed at her, his expression intense and compelling. Then, to Marnie's horror, he began opening and shutting his mouth, making ungodly noises deep in his throat, the muscles in his face and neck working as if he were choked by something terrible. Marnie fled into the cottage and slammed the door, but there was no way to bolt it, and she could hear him coming up the grass, still making the awful sounds. "Jesus, defend me!" she whispered, frantically making the sign of the cross against him and leaning with all her weight against the wood. But nothing happened, except that after a while there was a scuffle on the step and the sound of something placed there. Then she heard him running away. Long minutes passed before she had the courage to open the door to see what he had left. It was the basket with 6 brown eggs inside, and on top of them, washed and folded carefully, was the white cloth from the food she had given him yesterday. Mystified, she picked up the cloth. Who had washed it for him? And where did he get the basket of eggs? Not stolen them, surely. For her? She felt something small and hard inside the cloth and unfolded it. A tiny bronze cross lay in the whiteness. Suddenly, she smiled, then laughed. Collapsing against the door, her fears vanished. "Sweet Jesus," she said. "I thought he was going to spit devils on me, and he gave me instead a gift from the priest." Savoring every morsel, Marnie sat at the scrubbed table and ate 2 boiled eggs. Afternoon sun spilled through the broken roof, radiant on the tiny cross in front of her, and on the foxgloves she had found growing beside the stream. The cottage shone, the cauldron steamed in readiness for the fish and vegetables Isake had promised to bring back from the village, and the bed was remade on a pile of fresh grass. Beside Isake's toolbox stood a carved chest containing his clothes and other belongings. Before he went, he had locked the chest, putting the key in a little bag he wore around his neck. Marnie's things were in a smaller chest, beside her old spare shoes and winter boots. She owned only a few clothes, most made by her own hands, a basket of sewing equipment, and a painted plate her parents had given her for a wedding gift. The clothes she had worn yesterday were drying on the beach, and after her meal she went down to collect them. The blue dress she folded and placed with the shoes. Then she picked up the shift she had worn to bed last night. For a long time she stood there on the sand, staring at the torn garment. A tiny, rust-colored stain lay near the neck of it, where she had pricked her finger while sewing. Despairing, she thought of all the winter evenings she had spent by the fire with her mother and sisters, carefully making her clothes. She had been sewing the shift that fateful night when all this calamity began. Stricken with sudden, overwhelming grief, she sat on the stony shore, her ruined clothes crumpled in her hands, remembering. That night, her father had been working late on Sir William Isherwood's property, helping to search for a horse that had broken loose and run away. Her father's name was Michael, and he held a high position on the Lord's estate, ensuring that all the work due to the Lord was done correctly and on time, and that nothing was stolen or wasted or lost. Responsible for all the farm equipment, for the allocation of fodder for the beasts, the maintenance of buildings, and for the animals themselves, Michael answered for any losses or thefts. That was why he was late that night, searching for the missing horse. All the children were in bed, and only Marnie stayed by the fire to wait with her mother, Deidre. While they waited, they sewed. It was a blustery night in early winter, and a draught whistled under the old door and through the gaps in the window shutters. The flames of the candles leaped in the gusty air, and the writhing shadows made needlework difficult. In the dim edges of the room stood shelves and chests for belongings, all handmade by Michael. Along one wall were stairs leading to the 2 bedrooms above. Marnie thought she heard a sound outside and raised her head, thinking it was her father, home at last. But it was only the grunting of unsettled animals in their walled enclosure behind the house. There were not many animals left now. Food was scarce in winter, and only the strongest animals were kept alive for breeding next spring. 2 of the pigs, killed for winter meat, hung on chimney hooks above the fire, being preserved in the smoke. The smell of bacon mingled with the smoke that billowed into the room. "Go to bed, child," Deidre said near midnight. "I'll wait for Michael and keep some soup hot for him. You need your sleep." "So do you," Marnie smiled. "Besides, tomorrow I'll be working for us, so I can sleep later in the morning, if I want to. If it's not raining tomorrow, I'll take a sack of wheat to the miller. We need more flour." Like all those old enough to work, Marnie labored for 3 days a week on the Lord's property. In return for the labor done for him, Sir William gave each family a house on a small portion of his wider estate, so they could keep animals and grow food for their own use. It was not easy tending 2 lots of land. At the busiest times of the year, the villagers were bound to give all their time to the Lord, until his land was plowed, his grain sown, or his harvest brought in, and only then could they tend to their own small holdings and make the best of it somehow, if rain had spoiled their own harvests, or the weather ruined their farming schedules. At 16, Marnie was the only child of Michael's old enough to render weekly service to Sir William. Because her father had been elected as overseer on the Lord's estate, she could have been given lighter duties, but she took no privileges and worked harder than most. That worried her mother. "I heard that your father had you mending thatch on the manor barn," remarked Deidre now, contemplating her daughter's roughened hands. "He should give you lighter work." "I asked if I could help with the thatching," Marnie replied. "It was not so dull as milking cows, and it was a wonderful view from the roof. I could see over the manor house, past the village and the church, over the windmill and the hills. I saw the sea, Mama! I saw the sea!" "'Tis the only view of it you'll be likely to get," said her mother, trying not to smile. "And you're lucky it wasn't your last. Your father should know better. Maids aren't meant to climb up ladders. It's dangerous." "He let me because I asked. He often lets me help with his tasks. I helped him mend the plow the other day. I like to know how to do these things. It keeps my mind sharp." "Your mind, child?" cried Deidre, laughing. "What do you need a mind for? You have a perfectly fine body. And from what I heard, it'll get you all you need." "What do you mean?" A shrewd smile played about Deidre's lips, and she said softly, "I heard mention of the Lord's middle son the other day. I heard he was seen talking to you." Marnie blushed, and in her confusion pricked her finger with the needle. A tiny spot of blood stained the milk-white undergarment. "It was nothing," she said, her head bent low over her sewing. "He wished me a good day, that's all, while I was winnowing grain in his barn. And he said he liked the way I acted my part in the village play. It was politeness, that's all. It was nothing." "If it was nothing, then why so red about the cheeks?" said Deidre softly. "It's nothing to be ashamed of, Marnie. If Sir William's middle son has a liking for you, that's a fine thing." "He's old, Mama. He's seen as many summers as Papa has. His children are all married." "That's no matter. He's a handsome man and good-tempered, and he's the only one of those 3 sons who will roll up his sleeves and do any work. And since his wife died, he's given no cause for gossip. They say he likes his drink, but that can be overlooked. You'd never do better, and it's not as if you've got a lad you have a liking for." "But he's a lord. He'd never consider the likes of me." "True, he's a lord, but his family's lost most of their land one way or another, and he's not so grand any more that he wouldn't favor a common lass. Besides, you're not as common as most. You're the overseer's daughter, and our house is one of the best in the village, excepting the manor itself, of course." "But he doesn't even know me, Mama. We've hardly spoke. We danced, that's all, on Harvest Eve. And he fetched you a cup of ale and gave you a basket of apples, and twice he told your father how your work pleases him." "He often praises his workers. He's a fair master." "Aye, and he'd make a fair husband, too. If he ever asks you, Marnie, you'll be a fool to turn him down." Remembering that conversation now, Marnie thought how strange it was that they had talked of Isake Isherwood. It was almost as if, in speaking the words, they had let loose a force on earth and had invited fate. And fate it was, surely, that struck their home that night, because soon after that talk, the door had burst open and 3 men carried Michael in, unconscious, foaming at the mouth and with his eyes rolled back in his head. They said he had been found face down in a field, palsied but alive. No one knew for certain what had happened, but as it was the midnight hour, it was presumed that he had most likely been chased by ghostly hounds, or attacked by the devil himself. And when, 2 days later, Michael regained consciousness but was unable to move or speak coherently, it was evident that he had encountered something too dreadful to describe. So they put him to bed, and the children were made to creep around so they would not disturb him. Deidre spent every hour at his side, trickling broth into his gaping mouth, changing his bed and clothes when he fouled himself, and talking to him in a vain effort to bring back his wandering mind. The priest came and exorcised the stricken man, but it made no difference. In secret, a powerful old woman was brought in to stroke Michael's body while she spoke magic incantations. But that accomplished nothing either, except that Deidre lived in fear after, in case the priest should find out. On most days, Marnie worked about their own house, tending to the animals, mending clothes, cooking, and trying to keep the youngest children quiet. The older children helped her, and relatives took the 2 babies to free Deidre to nurse her husband. They were terrible days, for everyone knew that unless Michael could take up his work again, they would lose their house and farm, which Sir William had allotted them, and face poverty and starvation. As Marnie snatched brief moments at the windows, looking out at the bleak earth and the flurries of snow across their own small piece of land, fear settled over her. And all the time she grieved for the strong, vibrant father, who now lay babbling and incontinent. Theirs was not the only tragedy. 2 days after Michael's misfortune, they heard there was a fire at the manor house, and elderly Sir William had been burned to death. The priest was very busy then, exorcising fields and houses and even animals. The bad luck stopped after that. And then Gerard, the eldest of the dead lord's 3 sons, came to the house of Michael. Solemn-faced, in quiet tones, he told them that since there was no improvement in Michael's condition, a new overseer had been elected. This house, and the farm that went with it, and all the animals, would go to the new man. "But where will we go, my lord?" asked Deidre, her face deathly white. I cannot move out with 12 children and a palsied husband and go nowhere. Not with winter coming on. How shall we live? The new lord was compassionate, but firm. I'm sorry, woman, but that is not my concern. My father has just died, my home partly burned and in need of repair, and the villagers are disorganized without an overseer. There is a smaller cottage for the new man, if he will accept it. But even if he does, and you stay here, you will have to pay rent, since your husband is unable to work for us, and your sons are not yet old enough to work. We can't pay, wept Deidre. How can we earn money? I can work, sir, said Marnie, coming forward. I'll work 5 days instead of 3 on your land, in exchange for this house and its farm. Frowning thoughtfully, Gerard regarded her. He had noticed her working alongside her father, doing tasks other women would have refused. I have no doubt that you can work well, he said, but it is still not a man's work, and not enough to merit this house and land. I'll work as much as any lad who is my age, said Marnie, and we'll continue to pay our other dues. We'll still pay an egg out of every 6, and 2 of each kind of animal every year, and my sisters will still weave a garment each season for your household, and— What of your own farm? Asked Gerard. Is it to be neglected? My oldest son, Nathy, is 12, said Deidre. He can work it, with help from the younger ones. Will not cause you any trouble, my lord, nor neglect what you give us. For a long time Gerard looked into the fire, his face thoughtful and grave. At last he said, I'll talk it over with my brothers, and with the new overseer. If all are in agreement, so be it. But it was an agreement not easily reached. The new overseer was bitter at not being offered the house traditionally owned by the man in his position. However, wishing to avoid conflict with the manor lord, which might have jeopardized his own new standing in the village, he moved his wife and 2 children into the lesser house and kept his grievances to himself. Christmas came, and Marnie insisted that Deidre take the children to the great feast in the manor house, while Marnie stayed behind to look after her father. She and Michael were the only villagers not at the festivities. It was a cold and sorrowful day, though Marnie cherished the time alone with her father, telling him stories and acting out Christmas plays for him. He did not show any awareness, except that he cried. It was afternoon, and she had already lit the candles, when there was pandemonium outside, and the children burst in, powdered with snow, smelling of cider and gingerbread, and with their faces greasy with roasted meat. Shrieking and laughing, they rushed up to Marnie and thrust into her hands a basket covered with a bright green cloth. It's from him! They shrieked, jumping around like frenzied pups and begging her to open it. From him! The Lord's middle son! Marnie set the basket on her father's knee to open it, and found gifts of ham and Christmas puddings, nuts, and candied fruits. And there were scarlet ribbons for her hair. It's for you! The children chorused, grinning. Marnie bent her head, her cheeks hot. It's for Papa mostly, she mumbled. Plowing time arrived, and the new overseer began supervising the first work of the year on the Lord's lands, and people, realizing too late they had voted badly, grew to fear him and missed Michael, who had been honest and just and unchanged by the power given to him. Then Marnie came to the new overseer's notice, and he began to see a way to get the house he so badly coveted. Chapter 4. Groaning with the effort, Marnie hoisted the full sack onto her back. It was evening, and already the stony field glimmered with frost. The field had lain fallow for a long time, but the new overseer had ordered it plowed, and gave Marnie the task of removing the stones and clods the plow had thrown up. As she struggled toward the edge of the plowed land, she noticed a cloaked man watching her, and knew it was the overseer. Breathing hard, bent almost to double under her load, she staggered along the dark furrow to where he stood and dumped the stones and frozen clods onto the pile beside him. The pile was as high as Marnie's waist, for she had been clearing the field all day. These are in the wrong place, said the overseer, just as she finished emptying the sack. Slowly, painfully, she straightened. She dropped the sack on the ground and looked at the man's face. It was shadowed by the falling night, but she could see his breath white against the frosty air. He smelled of garlic. "They're in the wrong place," he said again. "They're where I was told to put them this morning, sir." "Then the man who told you must have misunderstood my orders. These are to fill that ditch behind the stables." "Can't I fetch a horse and wagon to do that, sir?" "They can't be spared. It's your task. It was supposed to be done today." "I'll get up early in the morning, sir, and do it." "You'll do it now. I told the Lord it would be done today. He'll not tolerate slack workers, girl. 'Twould be a crying shame to have to tell him that you can't complete your work in a proper manner. You'd be dismissed, and your family would lose that grand house." "I'll get up before dawn, sir, I promise. All this will be moved by noon tomorrow, I swear." "Your swearing isn't good enough. If this pile isn't in that ditch by morning, I'll be duty-bound to put in a complaint about your idleness." Then he strolled off, whistling to himself. "May I go home for a meal, sir?" she called after him. He ignored her. Shivering, her sweat suddenly cold on her skin, Marnie bent and began to fill the sack again. All that night she worked. At dawn, she trudged home through the fields, passing the other workers on their way to the manor farm, their faces shining in the morning sun, their spades and tools in their hands. Some took their oxen and plows to do their share of plowing for their lord. Several of the men called out to her, wondering why she was on her way home instead of to the fields, and asking how her father was, but she only shook her head, too weary to call back a reply. At home, her mother's face was grim as she put a bowl of porridge on the table in front of her daughter. The other children had eaten and were out tending the animals on the land behind their house. "'Tis not right how the new overseer harasses you," Deidre said, sitting down with Marnie while she ate. "He'll break you, girl. He'll drive you into the ground so he can have this house. I've heard it said that he took the other house against his will, rather than cause trouble at the start. But he'll have his way in the end." "No, he won't," said Marnie, her head low over her bowl. Though she had scrubbed her hands, they were still stained from the soil and her nails were torn. "He'll not break me, Mama, and you and Papa and the little ones won't be put out to starve, not while I live." She finished her meal and went back to the field. At noon she stopped to eat. Her mother had given her some bread, hard-boiled eggs, and dried figs wrapped in a cloth, which she ate while sitting against a tree. She was alone, the other workers being in different fields, sowing the barley. The sun was pleasurable, the spring day almost warm. Marnie closed her eyes. 4 hours later, the new overseer woke her, kicking her soundly with his boot. That night, while she was eating supper at home with her family, there was another visit from a son of the manor house. This time it was the man called Isake. Marnie answered the door when he knocked, and she was shocked to see him standing there, his hat in his hand, as if he were visiting people equal to himself. For once, the roguish smile was gone, and the dancing dark eyes were grave. "I've had a complaint from the new overseer," he said, very softly. "Do you mind if I come in to discuss it?" The color drained from Marnie's cheeks, and she nodded, unable to speak. He came in, bending his head as he passed under the lintel, for he was taller than most men. Seeing who was visiting, Deidre leaped up from the table, wiping her mouth on her apron, her face white and red by turns. Marnie's sisters giggled among themselves, and their mother told them to take their bowls of food to their room upstairs, and finish their meal there. The younger children looked at the lordly visitor, their spoons halfway to their mouths, potato soup dripping down their chins. "Sit down, please, sir," said Deidre, moving Michael's chair toward him. Marnie remained standing, her back to the fire, her body straight and tense. Isake Isherwood sat and faced her, his hat clenched in his strong hands, his fur-trimmed tunic and handsome face ruddy in the firelight. To Marnie's astonishment, he smiled. "Don't look so alarmed, lass," he said. "I want to hear your side of it." "Her side of what, sir?" asked Deidre, sitting down suddenly at the table again and absent-mindedly pushing her plate away. "What has she done?" I fell asleep today, Mama, when I stopped at noon, Marnie explained. Confronting the man, she said, I'd worked all night, sir, and I fell asleep. I'm sorry, it won't happen again. No, it won't, he said heavily. No one on this estate is expected to work day and night. Who told you to? I'd rather not say, sir. The new overseer tells me that you're idle, that you're defiant and uncooperative. Silent, she would not look at him. He noticed that there were dark shadows under her eyes, and she had got thinner. I haven't seen you lately sowing barley with the other maids, he remarked. No, sir. Be straight with me. Is he unfair to you? It's not for me to criticize him, sir. He has stated a complaint. It concerns the work you do in exchange for your family keeping this house. You realize the consequences if his complaint is taken to the court and his accusation proved? Yes, sir. We are holding another court in the manor house 3 days from now. You will be fairly listened to if you answer him. Would you like to do that? No, sir. Then you admit your fault? I do not, sir. Isaac sighed and stood up. I'll tell him that I reprimanded you, he said, and that I have given you a second chance. He added in tender tones that made her cheeks burn, If you have difficulties, lass, come and see me. Will you do that much to help yourself? Yes, sir. She lifted her head then and looked at him, and saw his red lips curved, his dark eyes smoldering. Without another word, Isaac put on his hat and went out into the night. Marnie did have difficulties, but she never went to him. She endured in silence, and not even her own family knew the heavy work that was required of her, or the words of abuse and scorn heaped on her by the overseer. Then, one evening at the beginning of summer, events changed. Michael had been carried downstairs to sit in his old chair by the fire. He was still paralyzed, and Marnie fed him his supper, all the while talking to him about the work being done on the Lord's farm, and how the other villagers were. When she talked, he watched her face as if he listened, and sometimes he tried to answer, though his sounds were unintelligible. Marnie was sure he could understand everything, but could do or say nothing, and her heart ached as she imagined his intolerable frustration and suffering. She had just finished feeding him when there was a knock on the door, and one of the children brought in Isake Isherwood. Isaac greeted Michael and sat in a chair opposite him, but apart from shaking violently for a moment or two, the sick man made no reaction. Marnie stood beside her father, her hand on his shoulder, and faced the visitor. Deidre sat at the table, the younger children gathered about her knees. The older ones saw the grave look in the visitor's face and guessed their sister was in trouble again. Meek and solemn, they listened to what he said. I've had another complaint from the overseer, Isaac told them, but I would rather discuss it just with the lass accused and with her parents. Alarmed, Marnie's mother ushered the little ones upstairs and sent the older girls to look after them. They sat on the top stair, hushed, straining to hear what was said in the room below. But Isaac's voice was very quiet, and they could hardly hear. Watching Marnie carefully, he asked, Have you any idea what this latest complaint is about, Marnie? No, sir, she replied, white-lipped. I've done nothing wrong that I know of. I broke 2 eggs the other day when the goose attacked me. 'Tis a fearful bird, sir, when it's riled. I'll give you 2 of our eggs for the manor house, if that's what the bother is. It's not about the eggs. It's about the ploughman's boy, Jaunty. Marnie frowned, confused. Jaunty? But I haven't talked to him since last Michaelmas, when we walked together to take our tithing gifts to the manor, sir, and that was only because we happened on the same path. I don't like talking to him much. Why is that, Marnie? Color flooded her cheeks and she looked away. He tried to court me once, sir. Well, not courting exactly. In the brew house, when no one else was around, he tried. Anyway, I boxed his ears, sir, and made his nose bleed. He's not liked me much since. Isaac rubbed his beard and tried to hide a smile behind his hand. You look after yourself well, then, he said. Aye, sir, I have to. And you've not seen Jaunty since? You're quite sure of that? I've seen him plowing, sir, and a few days ago I saw him with the sowers in the field by the wild wood. He was shooting stones at the crows to keep them off the new sown barley. He's cunning with the slingshot, sir. Jaunty says you saw him yesterday. I did not, sir. Early in the morning I drove the sheep to the high pasture to graze on the new grass there, and was all day with them. I saw no one. In unhurried tones, without reproach or accusation, and all the time studying her face, Isaac said, The new overseer is very clear about what he saw. He says, he saw you yesterday in the hay barn, you and Jaunty together. You were in the hay with him. That's a wicked lie. I don't care who said it, Jaunty or the overseer or the Lord himself, begging your pardon, sir, but it's a lie. All yesterday I was out with the sheep while they grazed. Who saw you there? No one. I was alone, shepherding them. I believe you, but this scandal, if it spreads, will force you and your family out of this place. But it's a lie, sir. That I know. I consider it but a small matter myself, but the new overseer says he wants no such goings-on while he's in charge. Besides, Jaunty is betrothed to his niece, and the overseer wants you gone before you cause any more trouble and put a slur on his family. I've done nothing, sir, and what of my family? What about the slur on us? I'll not allow this to happen. I'll answer him in court if I have to. You have the right to do that, but unless you have someone who saw you all day yesterday with the sheep, who will swear in court that you were there, you have no chance. There are 2 witnesses against you, and the overseer will win his case. I don't understand, sir. Why should Jaunty lie? I never did him any harm. You boxed his ears. You hurt his manly honor, and the overseer may have paid him well to support this plot, though that could never be proved. What of my honor? Cried Marnie. He hurts mine and gets away with it. It's unfair. I know, lass. What can I do? Nothing, I'm afraid. But since the overseer has made an official complaint, and it is the second against you, we can't overlook it. Right or wrong, it's a blemish on your character, which folks won't forget. You have to be removed from service on our land. There was utter silence in the house, and Marnie looked down at the dying fire in the hearth, her eyes full of pain and rage. I cannot answer him in court, sir, she said at last. No one saw me with the sheep, and since it was the overseer himself who told me to take them there, alone, I can't ask him to be my witness. But even if this thing were true, and I swear it's not, it should not cause such a stir. The workers, they're always... Well, you know what it's like, sir, but none of them are named to you, and what they do isn't made a public disgrace. And Jaunty, I'll warrant you won't send him away, though he's supposed to be as guilty as me. It's only me that's being punished, me that's sent away, because the overseer wants this house. It's all wrong, sir, and it's a lie. I know, but there is one way out of it, said Isaac softly. He hesitated, looking at Michael's impassive face. The sick man appeared to be dozing, though his eyes were not quite closed. His head lolled on the cushions, and his hands were limp on the quilt covering his lap. Isaac turned to Deidre. I wish I could say these things to your husband, he said, but since he cannot speak, I must say them to you. I hope you will hear me out and give me your honest answer. When my father died, he left the manor to my 2 brothers and their wives and families. To me, he left another house. It's a good day's journey away, near the village of Torcurra by the sea, and is worth more than all my father's lands put together. I'm going there. Since my brothers and I have valued all that your husband did for us, before this evil struck him down, we do not want to turn you out from your house, or take away the land that you have worked. However, something must be given in exchange. It seems your daughter cannot work any longer on our land, but there is another duty she can do. If you will permit her to marry me and look after me in my new home, we will accept that as a fair and right payment for this house and land, which you may keep for as long as your daughter lives. This would save you from being turned out on the street, and it would get your daughter out of an intolerable situation." For a long time, Deidre was speechless. Slowly, as if in a dream, she got up, curtsied low to Isaac, and said, "Sir, I would count it an honor for you to have my daughter, and so would Michael, if he could but say. And I thank you, sir, with all my heart, for taking our Marnie out of disgrace, and doing her such a great favor. God bless you, sir." Isaac stood up and faced Marnie, and his dark eyes sparkled at the stunned look on her face. "Well, lass," he said, with one black eyebrow raised and laughter in his smile, "what is your word on the matter? Is it yes or no?" Suddenly there was a movement in Michael's chair, and he lifted his left hand, fluttering it wildly in Isaac's direction. Red-faced and agitated, he babbled incoherently, spit dribbling from his sagging mouth. Never had he reacted so much since his affliction, and his family stared at him, astounded. His babble rose to a wail, and he rolled his eyes sideways, trying to see Marnie. "It's all right, Papa," she said softly, kneeling in front of him and taking his hands in hers. Immediately he became still. She bent her head until her forehead rested on their clasped hands, and for a long time she did not speak, but her breathing was troubled and uneven, and she sighed often. When she lifted her face, it was calm, though her cheeks were wet with tears. "This is the only way, Papa," she whispered. "If I do it, it is for love of you, all of you. At least let me see that you will be happy, staying here in your own home, and watching your vegetables grow, and seeing your lambs born in the spring. God shall look after me." Michael shook violently, but he did not wail again. Marnie stood and kissed him, and whispered something else in his ear that made tears roll down his cheeks. Then she turned to the man Isaac. "Well, lass," Isaac asked, "will you agree to marry me?" She replied so quietly he hardly heard, "Yes." "'Tis settled, then." He smiled, and he lifted her hand and kissed her fingers. They were married 2 days later, in the little church on the edge of the manor land. All right, I hope you're enjoying the story so far, and we'll see you again next week for our final reading from this book. Have a good weekend. Bye.